Hello, welcome to the second webinar in our series on qualitative data. Thank you for joining us. This webinar was developed and is being presented by staff from the Evaluation Center at the University of Colorado, Denver. And this work is being funded by the State Tobacco Education Prevention Program at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And there are two presenters today. My name is Erica Clark, and I'm an evaluation specialist at the Evaluation Center. And my colleague is Peter, and he'll introduce himself now.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Peter Rumbach, and I'm also with the Evaluation Center as an evaluation specialist. And we're excited to talk today a little bit about qualitative data analysis. So we're using Zoom, and I think most of you have probably used Zoom, but if you haven't, at the bottom of your screen, you can see a variety of different functions, including the ability to chat during our webinar. So please feel free to type questions you may have as we go through, and we'll try to address them as you ask or at different points throughout the webinar, definitely at the end. You also notice that the video and audio are muted. So if you could please leave those muted by not clicking them. We are recording this webinar, which will be archived, and we'll put it up on our website, the STEPP evaluation website, along with some other resources and the slides from today's presentation. And we'd also like to know how many folks are participating. So if you could go ahead and click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type your name and organization, that would be great. And if there's anyone else in the room with you, if you could also type their name, that would be great. And if you're not a STEPP grantee, if you could type the name of the grantee organization with whom you work, we would appreciate that. Great, so it looks like some of your typing your information in there. Thanks for that. So this is the second webinar in our series on qualitative data. And then also in 2017, to be decided, we'll be talking about a few different topics related to dissemination of your results.
So these are the goals for the webinar today. After the webinar, we hope you'll be able to explain how qualitative analysis is similar and different from quantitative analysis, analyze data using 4 common qualitative analysis methods without data analysis software, and describe common reporting methods of qualitative results.
So if any of you sat in on last week's webinar when we talked about qualitative data collection, you probably remember this slide. We just want to remind everybody that qualitative data, we mean descriptive data, usually in words such as opinions, behaviors, and attributes that are non-numeric. Qualitative data can also be pictures or video. So some common type of qualitative data with spoken words would be individual or group interviews, as well as focus groups. And then as far as written words, that would be open response items or essays. So please refer to the first webinar for recommendations on collecting qualitative data. In this webinar, we'll assume you have already collected your data and are ready to analyze it. So there are some similarities between qualitative and quantitative data analyses. Both of them look at systematic approaches, look at the data in systematic approaches, even though these approaches may vary. Qualitative analysis helps us to understand the big picture, the same as statistical results. So both are ways to make sense of large quantities of data by identifying what is significant. Qualitative analysis identifies patterns and themes in words and sometimes pictures, whereas quantitative analysis is with numeric data. Quantitative analysis often attempts to generalize those results from a sample to a broader population of interest. And qualitative data often attempts to assess common patterns or themes from a select group of key stakeholders. And qualitative analysis produces a framework for communicating your results. That is, the themes or patterns you discover are often the primary pieces of information you will disseminate or communicate with stakeholders. The qualitative analysis really has no formulas or rules for drawing conclusions and determining significance. It really is both an art and a science. However, there are many guidelines that help increase the rigor and trustworthiness of your analysis. We'll share some guidelines and practical tips to increase your confidence in analyzing and interpreting qualitative data.
Just like with quantitative data analysis, your first step is to prepare and clean your data. As we discussed in the previous webinar on collecting qualitative data, it's important to record your data during the data collection process, either by taking careful notes or audio recording. If your audio recorded your interview, your first step is to transcribe verbatim each interview. You can do this yourself, or there are transcription services available for a fee. The second step is to organize your data into big chunks. For open response survey items, this is usually done by separating each individual's response by survey question. For interview data, this can be done by dividing your notes or transcripts from each individual's interview and creating a separate file or sheet in your Excel file by interview question. For both open response survey items or interview data, you can set up your files in either a Word or Excel file, and we'll demonstrate this, both methods, later in the webinar. The final preparation step is to clean your data. Read through all files to be sure your notes or transcripts are clear. When using audio recording, sometimes insider key terms or acronyms are misspelled by the transcriptionist and need to be corrected. So you may need to go back to your audio recording, listen again, and make corrections in your transcription document. In this process, you will most likely want to de-identify your data to remove names of individuals to protect their confidentiality. Depending on how sensitive your data is, you may want to remove names of businesses, schools, or even the organization. Replace identifiable information with a generic term. So not Mary Jones, rather a city official. There are two approaches to qualitative data analysis, inductive and deductive. Let's do a simple example to illustrate these two approaches. Imagine you've encountered hundreds of bicycles that you need to sort systematically. You begin by looking through the entire stack of bicycles. You begin to notice how they are the same and how they're different. What characteristics might you notice? So take a moment here to think about this and type some ideas into the chat box of what might be the characteristics that you notice amongst all these bicycles. Great. Someone mentioned color, type of bike, the size. Anything else? Other things we thought of were the condition of the bike, if it's old or new, how expensive the bike looks, or also, yep, the quality of the bike. Great. So, as an example, let's say I decide to categorize my data, the bikes, using the inductive approach based on the function of the bike. I pick up the first bike and notice it has smooth, skinny tires. I think this bike may be most functional on paved roads, so I label it as a road bike. I define my code or category of road bike by the type of tires. Then I pick up the next bike. It has wider groove tires. I also notice it has heavy-duty shock absorbers. I decide this would be most functional on mountain trails, so I code it as a mountain bike. The next bike I encounter is very small and has very small, sturdy tires and a sturdy frame. I think this bike may be most functional for trick riding, so I code it as a trick bike. I proceed through the stacks of bikes, sorting them into my 3 codes based on perceived function. When I encounter exceptions that do not fit into my existing categories, like this one pictured, I create a new label or code. I'm engaging in inductive coding. My codes emerge from my observation of the data. In this approach, the patterns in your particular data rise to the top without being influenced by any predetermined theories or other information. In this case, as I observe each bike, I'm creating and modifying my codebook, which is a list of codes and definitions as I encounter new cases. I may refine the codebook as I move through this process, collapsing codes into larger themes or adding codes if there's a one-of-a-kind type of bike. Codebooks are useful for creating standard definitions, especially if multiple people are working on your analysis. Inductive analysis differs from deductive analysis, which is based on predetermined codes from your hypothesis or theory. For example, if I researched bicycles in advance of analysis and found that there are many distinct types of bicycles, and I used a catalog with photos and definitions to sort the bicycles, I would be engaging in deductive analysis. I would create a codebook based on the photos and definitions that I found in the magazine. With the deductive approach, I compare each case to pre-identified codes or categories. Then, as in this example, I would assign one or more of these categories or codes to each bicycle. With the deductive approach, I may still encounter cases that don't fit in the predetermined code, so I would modify my codebook accordingly.
So now we'll look at 4 commonly used types of qualitative analysis. As we go through each example, we'll use our mock bicycle evaluation and the data we collected. For those of you who participated in last week's webinar, we actually went out and conducted mock interviews to collect data and created mock evaluation questions just to have some sort of data to use for these webinars. So we're going to go ahead and consider those as we talk about our approaches. However, please consider how you might use these approaches in your work and with data you have collected or plan to collect in the future. We'll demonstrate each of these methods in the next section without specialized software, just in case you don't have the resources to buy software, because it can really be expensive. So using Word or Excel or something most of you already have. If you did choose to work with large or complicated data sets, you might want to consider purchasing some qualitative data. Some common ones are in vivo or Atlas TI. And then we recently came across another type of software that's offered online on a monthly subscription basis. It's an average of $10 per month. It varies from $8.95 up to, I think, $13.95, and that depends on whether it's an individual user, a small team, or more teams, or a larger team. And so I think this could be a good option if you're thinking about collecting qualitative data, once a year, and really only going to be doing an analysis over the span of a month. That would be a lot cheaper than purchasing something like in vivo. However, these analysis software do have a considerable learning curve, so you might want to also consider using Word or Excel, because those are also viable options. So the first type of qualitative analysis is constant comparison, which is an inductive approach in which you chunk data into groups based on comparisons with already analyzed data. So themes can surface as similar data are chunked into categories. So these are the basic general steps to conducting a constant comparison analysis. And the final product is a set of themes. So first, it's good to read through the entire set of data before beginning to chunk and label. This can give you a sense of the overall conversation or open-ended survey responses before beginning to deconstruct into pieces. And then second, as you are rereading pieces of data, you can begin to divide and chunk these based on descriptive categories or codes. You'll find you might first begin with big buckets of codes before further chunking those into smaller buckets. And then, as we mentioned in the third one, you can begin to label those chunks with your codes. And this is what Erica was talking about, where you are developing your code book as you're inductively doing your analysis. And then fourth, as you chunk each new piece of data, compare with previous codes to see if information represents a new code or if it fits within an existing category that you already created. And then fifth, depending on data, decide whether new codes are needed and whether codes may eventually be expanded or collapsed. So as you can kind of see as I'm talking through this, it really is a pretty inductive process where you're kind of revisiting each of the codes as you're developing them to determine whether you need to add, collapse, or expand on those. So let's use the constant comparison analysis method with actual interview data. We did conduct interviews with 5 individuals who commute by bicycle. You might remember one of the videos that we showed during the first webinar. So first, we read through all the transcripts at least once, and we decided to use our interview questions for the initial division of our data. One of our evaluation questions was, what motivates citizens in our community to commute to work by bicycle? And one of our interview questions related to this evaluation question was, what are some benefits that you perceive to commuting to work by bicycle? So based on this, we chunked out parts of each interview relevant to this interview question into a basic Microsoft Word table. So you can see the question at the top, and then you can see the different responses that we put into the table. You could also use Excel with this approach. So our first step was to cut and paste from the transcripts, putting each person's response to this interview question into a cell in the Word table. And we're actually just showing 3 of the 5 responses on this slide for ease of reading for the webinar. So for our next step, we begin to identify codes in the text. And we notice each of these interviewees mentioned exercise as a benefit. So I think that can be our initial code, and we can go ahead and record that in our left-hand column. However, each of these interviewees also noted other benefits within each comment related to this question. So we can handle those multiple responses in one of 2 ways. We can duplicate the entire comment into a new cell for each additional code, or we can dissect the response so that each sentence or phrase represents a separate code. So whichever method you choose, be sure to note this in your findings or in whatever report that you produce, so it does not appear you have more responses than you actually collected. You might report and say something like, interviewees offered statements that may have been coded to multiple themes. So that doesn't misrepresent the number of interviews you conducted. Rather, it reflects the number of statements that were actually offered by interviewees. So for our example, let's use the dissection method, or breaking up statements into multiple themes. To add new codes, we'll add new rows to our table and move the dissected sentences or phrases to a new cell. So in this case, interviewee number 1 says bicycling helps you decompress after a stressful day. And interviewee number 2 makes similar comments about cooling down in the afternoon after a long day. So we will move both of those to new rows with a new code. We'll label our new code as decompress. And when possible, it's important to use the actual words of the interviewees when developing your codes. This is known as in vivo or within the living coding. We'll continue this process as we analyze other interviewees' responses, either adding them to existing codes by inserting additional rows or creating new codes. As you can see from this example, interviewee number 3 notes the benefits to the environment and to being able to see more on a bike. We would dissect these sentences and place them in new rows with new appropriate codes. Sometimes you may want to collapse codes into larger themes, creating groupings of codes. So for example, exercise and decompress could be collapsed into a larger theme of promotes personal health. Your final product using the method of constant comparison analysis is your set of themes, and that's what you can share with stakeholders. So I think something to note here, it's really up to you. There's no right or wrong whether you choose to aggregate up to a larger theme or keep each of these as a separate theme. It's kind of in how you want you and your team or whoever is conducting the analysis to represent those concepts to the audience that you're trying to communicate with. So another important point to remember, we divided our transcript into chunks based on the interview question. However, interviewees often respond to the focus of one question while responding to another question. So for example, we found our interviewees mention new benefits at the end of the interview when asked, do you have any additional comments? So it's important to read through the entire transcript when preparing the data initially to be sure that all relevant pieces are included in the coding process. So from our previous slides, if there were additional benefits that were mentioned, we would want to chunk those in and conduct the analysis with our benefits question. So this kind of so you see the transcript globally and know that just because you ask a question, the data may not necessarily be contained in that part of the transcript. It could be in other parts.
Great. So the second type of qualitative analysis is called classical content analysis, and it's a deductive approach. It differs from constant comparison in that codes are predetermined and it's often quantified. While this method can also be done in Word, we'll give an example using Excel. And both these approaches can be completed in either Word or Excel, as Peter showed. So these are the basic general steps to conducting a content analysis. The final product is a list of codes and the number of times each code is used. Similar to the constant comparative, it's good practice to read through the entire set of data before beginning to divide and chunk the data. The next step is to divide and chunk the data into smaller parts. These are the statements from the responses in the transcript. Next, you'll label each chunk with the predetermined code. In the last step, you'll quantify the number of times each code is used. So to use the classical content analysis method on our interview data, we'll look at another interview question from our mock study. What are some of challenges you have experienced in commuting to work by bicycle? And this question was designed to inform the larger evaluation question of, in what ways could our community increase bicycle commuting? So for this example, as I mentioned, we'll use Excel to code our data. After reading through all transcripts as your first step, chunk your data in the Excel spreadsheet. For our example, we did our initial chunking by interview protocol question, like we did in the previous example. We usually create a separate sheet for each interview question in our coding file. Notice that this one is labeled challenges as the sheet tab label on the bottom of the screen. We cut and pasted the individual responses from the transcripts into this Excel worksheet. We then listed our predetermined codes. These were the codes or categories we expected to see based on our review of current news articles and our studies and literature about bicycle commuting. In this case, we listed time, weather, clothing, safety, and a catch-all category of other for any responses that were unexpected. We defined each of these codes that we know, so that we knew dealing with drivers of cars was a safety code, for example, and that would all be recorded and documented in your code book with all the definitions of those. Then, once we have our spreadsheet set up, we begin to code by reading each response and putting a tick or a number 1 in the column for the appropriate code. The cells here are shaded yellow just for illustration purposes so you can see what we mean. Notice that interviewee number 1 on row 2 mentions time and safety and also an unanticipated code. The unexpected response was coded other, and then a quick note was made about the content there. It says, has a number 1 and then no bike lane. Once coding is completed, the other responses can be reviewed inductively to see if any new codes have emerged. Because we're working in Excel, we can easily sum the responses by adding up all the number 1s in that column. When reporting, it's important to share that because interviewees often gave multiple responses, totals will be larger than the sample size or the number of interviews.
And I just wanted to add one thing. You might have noticed comparing this with the first approach that we talked about, that really you could use, I mean, the difference is that you predetermine what codes you're going to use by entering them at the top of the spreadsheet for this case. But if you wanted to enter chunk your data out using a spreadsheet, you could also just develop your codes inductively as you're doing your analysis. So I just kind of want to point out those similarities, and then the one difference really is having your hypothesis or idea that you already know that you're going to look for codes within the data.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Peter. So we thought we would take a pause right now and thinking about these first 2 approaches we reviewed. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we move on to the 3rd and 4th qualitative data analysis approach? Feel free to type anything in the chat box.
All right. Well, hopefully that means we explained it clearly. If you have any questions as we continue into the 3rd and 4th approaches, make sure that you note them, and we'll have time for questions towards the end as well.
Great. So the 3rd type of qualitative data analysis is keyword in context. These are the steps for conducting a keyword in context analysis. Similar to the other methods we've reviewed, it's good practice to read through the entire set of data, all of your transcripts. And the next step then is to identify the keywords. These may be words that are used frequently or unique words or unusual words that you are relevant to the work you're doing. Next, you'll listen to words that come before and after the keyword. And then the last step is to interpret this list of keywords or phrases, and we'll see this in the sample data in just a moment. So to use the keyword analysis method in our interview data, we'll look at another interview question. We've talked about your experience. Now let's turn to thinking about the community. In your opinion, what would encourage others to commute by bike more often? So just like the previous examples, this question was designed to inform the larger evaluation question of, in what ways could our community increase bicycle commuting? So these are the Microsoft Word steps to conducting a search. For our example, we noticed in reading through all of the transcripts that interviewees frequently talked about bike paths or bike lanes. We can use the keyword in context method to isolate those references to better understand the meaning. In our transcript, we can locate words that we identify ourselves using the find function in Microsoft Word. Because there are many versions of Word, this process might be slightly different on your own computer. But in general, you'll follow the steps to find words or phrases and use highlighting to see where the keywords or phrases are located in the data, in the text and their responses. The advantage of using this method is that you can then expand the highlighted section so that you can see how it was used in context. And you also control which word is considered to be a key word. So here's an example from our interviews. Here we were interested in how often the keywords bike lanes were used by our interviewees. We did the advanced find to highlight the words, and then we could read the surrounding text to understand the context. We found the words bike lanes were sometimes used in the context of a suggestion for improvement in the community, while others referred to existing bike lanes as a factor that encouraged them to commute. In this case, the results provide useful suggestions for community leaders interested in improving bike lanes. And by searching all transcripts for the same keyword, a list of ways to improve bike lanes could be generated for a report, say, from these community leaders. Another way is to use keyword analysis. It is to determine the frequency of specific words in your data. There are free online programs such as these listed, among other words, including downloadable free programs. These programs typically generate a word cloud from text that you can cut and paste into the program. They have a variety of features, but generally they show the frequency of a word is used, how frequent is that word used in the text, and it enhances the size of that font in the resulting word cloud. So the words that are larger font are more frequently represented or mentioned in your data. Many of these little programs allow you to customize your cloud by changing the color, the font, even the shape of the cloud, the orientation of the words, either horizontal or vertical. And they all have different saving and printing options. They all kind of vary from these different programs. In this example that was created using Wordle, we pasted all the transcript text related to interviewee responses to the question about the benefits of commuting by bicycle. We selected mostly horizontal for the orientation of the text and limited to the 50 most frequently used words. We also removed common words such as of and the and, since those don't add to the meaning here. As you can see, exercise was the most commonly word used by our interviewees. Some of these programs will generate a list of words with the number of times it's used. In WordSift, found at wordsift.org, which was developed at Stanford University, you can hover over a word in your word cloud, and it'll show you how many times that word appears in the text that you selected. It'll also show where each word was used in context so that you can understand the intended meaning. So here it's showing the responses and the chunk or the questions, the words, sorry, in the text that are surround the keyword that is exercise. Word clouds are useful ways to visually present areas of emphasis in your qualitative data.
So the fourth and final approach we will review today is narrative analysis, or identifying stories within your data as a way to make meaning. This approach can be another way of interpreting your qualitative data. And with this method, we identify stories in the transcripts. And the stories can be summarized by plot or timeline. And with this approach, the actual stories are your products. You should be aware that not all data lends itself to this approach, as not all qualitative data will offer rich stories for analysis. And I think it can often depend on the types of questions you develop for your protocol. If you have probes where you're asking for specific examples, and kind of sometimes luck of the draw with your interviewee and whether they tend to be talkative and describe what their experience is through story or not. So it kind of just depends. If you have many stories in your sample, you can code the stories inductively for themes and then present the identified themes as your product. So that's kind of a play on using our first approach that we talked about in conjunction with this approach. So, for example, here is one story told by one of our interviewees. And we've used the interviewee's own words, but we edited it down to just the essential storyline. I'll give you a second to look over that. It's a pretty shocking story, and it actually didn't surface in one of the 5 interviews that we conducted. And so you can see qualitative data like this could be useful to support statements suggesting the need to educate drivers about interaction with bicyclists. And it also, depending on your audience, it might elicit an emotional response, kind of a call to action. This is a pretty serious thing that happened to this person while they were biking. And so if your audience was city council, even though this was only mentioned by one interviewee, it still is a story that has some weight to it. So those were the 4 approaches that we wanted to review today. And so choosing an approach really depends on your intended audience and how data will be collected. Do you have a hypothesis going into collecting data, or are you exploring through data collection? Depending on whether your approach is inductive or deductive, you may choose a different approach. Similarly, do you plan to develop a code book, that is, your codes and definitions prior to data analysis, or as you are conducting your analysis? This will also factor into your decision. You know, with surveys and developing surveys, we talked about looking for existing instruments. And that is also a case with qualitative research and evaluation. Sometimes there may be an area of research you're looking into where there are already existing protocols, and perhaps with those protocols, existing code books. So that can be something that factors into your decision as well. You're also not limited to just one approach. Depending on your data and available resources, you may choose to first conduct a keyword and context analysis to gain a broad overview of your data before beginning chunking and coding. This approach could help you begin to develop a code book. Does your data contain rich stories? And do you have an audience who would appreciate understanding the data in a story format? If so, perhaps this is an approach you would consider. So up on the screen, I've just kind of summarized what each of these approaches offers. And really, it's a discussion for you and your team as you look at your evaluation plan, you look at how you plan to collect and analyze that qualitative data and what you choose. And I mentioned, depending on your resources, we have mentioned qualitative data collection and analysis is pretty resource intensive. And so depending on the number of staff you have available to work on this, it might also factor into which approach you choose. So your final step with all 4 approaches to qualitative analysis that we have demonstrated is to synthesize your results. So we like to think of synthesis as taking the 20,000-foot view of the data. What are the outstanding features, the major themes, the key learnings? Be cautious presenting codes or themes only expressed by one individual. You may overrepresent that perspective, and it can be hard to argue that it is a theme across interviewees with only one interviewee mentioning it. However, what if a theme is mentioned twice? Or similarly, what if it is only mentioned once, but it's an important idea for program improvement? So remember, this approach to qualitative data analysis is not always about the total number or percent that something is mentioned, but rather its overall significance in relation to the program or area of study. So with the classical content approach that Erica talked about, she did mention that you count the total number of times you coded something. And for certain audiences, that can be an important factor that they want to look at. So again, it really depends on your audience and thinking of it as an art, not necessarily as a science. And it's also important for you, along with your team, to discuss your threshold for including something as a theme in your data. And consider your audience in determining which approach you'll use as an appropriate product, as I've mentioned a couple of times. So here's an example of key learnings related to our evaluation question. In what ways could our community increase bicycle commuting? And based on our data analysis and synthesis, these 4 ways emerged. The product of the synthesis is a framework for presenting the results of our analysis. And in this case, we developed it into a list of the top 4 ways to encourage bicycle commuting by uncovering the 4 primary ways interviewees thought the community could increase bicycle commuting. And you know, lately on the internet, if you use social media, we're kind of inundated with these top ways, top lists. So at this point, I'm not sure whether it's a good thing to present that because people are so inundated with it, or whether because people are familiar with it, it can be a good way to present your data. So it's something to consider with your audience if you choose to use a list, top ways list.
So now we'll share a few best practices. As a qualitative researcher, it's helpful to share your synthesis results with a teammate. We often get so immersed in the data we can only see the details and not the big picture. So it's important to talk through the data and the themes, you know, as a team. While it's important to analyze qualitative data in teams, team members may need to have frequent conversations to ensure this inter-rater reliability. This may include preparing a code book by defining your codes and discussing responses that do not appear to fit in those current codes. And it's helpful to trade work and see if your teammate would code data, the transcript responses, in a different way, and then having discussions to reconcile any differences.
And one thing to add with the inter-rater reliability, if you have 2 people coding and you have the resources available, sometimes you can have those 2 coders code the same interview or multiple interviews independently, and then they come back together to compare what they found, and that can help them kind of hone in on what their final code book will be and understand how they're interpreting those codes related to the context of the data that they're looking at.
It's important to avoid forcing a fit with existing codes or oversimplifying the data. You can address this somewhat by looking for differences as well as similarities amongst your data responses. You'll need to explain your methods and limitations regarding your sampling strategy and sample size in your report, just to explain what you did and who you interviewed as part of a potential limitation to understanding. So here's a summary of some reporting options. You can write narrative text summarizing the key themes that you found in your data using the constant comparison analysis or classical content analysis. After you've synthesized and summarized your key themes, you could pull a representative quote from your data that will give the reader context, and it's used to emphasize that key theme. You can create a word cloud from the most frequently occurring words in a chunk or section of data, responses associated with, say, a particular interview question. You could share a narrative story from one of your interview participants that Peter shared. We'll be presenting another webinar series, hopefully in 2017, on reporting options. If you have qualitative or quantitative data that you are planning to present and prepare before then, we're happy to work with you individually and share on your reporting options and share more resources independently.
So we hope that today's webinar has achieved our goals and has increased your understanding of how qualitative and quantitative analyses are similar and how they're different, and encourage you to try one of the 4 common methods of analysis that we went over. So qualitative analysis can be time and resource intensive, but we find the results often greatly increase our understanding of complex issues and create memorable and impactful findings for decision makers. As you may remember, qualitative methods are also important to consider in complementing a quantitative approach. So a mixed methods approach offers both breadth and depth in understanding a question, program, or issue you are evaluating. So finally, here is the STEPP eval website, and this is where you can find the resources that we post related to each of the webinars, as well as a community forum where you can post any questions that you might have after the webinar that you didn't have an opportunity to ask during. Also, the past webinars and the slides for each of those are posted here. So if you have any colleagues that weren't able to attend but would like to sit in, they can access those archived there. And so finally, we'd just like to open it to any questions that you may have written down as you were listening to this presentation. You can feel free to type those in the chat box. Okay. Well, it looks like maybe, hopefully we did a great job and there weren't a lot of questions, or it was a lot of content and you're digesting, and maybe we'll have questions afterwards. As Erica mentioned, if anyone is working on qualitative methods or research in your area and you need a thinking partner or to talk through any of the pieces that we've talked about from the last webinar or this webinar, please reach out and we'd be happy to help. So thanks again for taking your time today and sitting in. We appreciate it.